Hello, everyone. My name is Tracy Osborne, and I'll be leading this module on climate change mitigation in tropical forests in equity perspective. This module takes a climate justice approach to addressing climate change in tropical forests. Welcome. So I'd like to briefly introduce myself before going into the course learning objectives and course content. As I mentioned, my name is Tracy Osborne, and I'm a faculty member at the University of California, Merced in the Department of Management of Complex Systems. I'm also the founding director of the Center for Climate Justice, a University of California system-wide center that harnesses the power of the university to support climate action in the state, the nation, and around the world in ways that forefronts climate justice. My research focuses on the social and political economic dimensions of climate change mitigation in tropical forests and the role of indigenous peoples. I also study the politics of climate finance, global environmental governance, and climate equity and justice. I've worked on these issues globally and have extensive field experience in the tropical forests of southern Mexico and the Amazon. I'm trained as an interdisciplinary scholar and received my PhD in energy and resources at the University of California, Berkeley. The main strategy for mitigating climate change in tropical forests is REDD+, which is a United Nations framework that aims to address climate change by stopping forest destruction. REDD+ stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation, and includes conservation, sustainable forest management, and the enhancement of carbon stocks. REDD has evolved over time and has been modeled on both payments for ecosystem services programs, as well as carbon forestry projects, which have been piloted since the 1990s. The main goal of REDD+ is to reduce emissions in the tropical forests of countries in the global south. REDD is also expected to generate sustainable development within the host country and deliver social and ecological co-benefits. In the context of REDD+, co-benefits include providing income to rural communities and supporting other ecosystem services, such as regulating water and conserving biodiversity. REDD is based on the assumption that forests offer a low-cost strategy for climate change mitigation. This is largely a factor of the location of tropical forests in developing countries with often relatively lower costs of land and labor. This assumption stems from a history of colonization and uneven development in many countries of the global south. However, there have been a number of key challenges of REDD projects well documented in the academic literature. In practice, REDD has been costly, challenging to implement, and controversial among many local communities and indigenous peoples. Despite the assumption of the cost effectiveness of forest-based climate change mitigation, REDD is quite costly to implement. Forest monitoring, carbon measurement, reporting, and third-party verification are expensive, raising the overall project costs. And in many cases, most of the financial benefits of these projects goes to third parties and government intermediaries, as opposed to the communities themselves who provide most of the on-the-ground labor. In addition, current low prices on carbon markets are insufficient to compete with the financially lucrative activities of soy, palm oil, beef, and timber. In this way, REDD has largely failed to address the primary drivers of deforestation. Instead, REDD projects have targeted indigenous and local community land uses as sites for intervention. Enrolled as participants, forest communities either restrict their land uses and/or plant trees in order to receive carbon payments, often insufficient to fairly compensate them for reduced forest access. Many empirical case studies of REDD+ document issues of constrained land access and lack of meaningful co-benefits in local communities. In response, safeguards attempt to address some of the concerns raised by local and indigenous communities, as well as unmet environmental integrity issues. Environmental integrity refers to the issues of additionality, leakage, and permanence, which are criteria that ensure long-term carbon storage and climate benefit. REDD projects must prove additionality, meaning that the carbon benefit is additional and would not have happened in the absence of the project. Additionality is violated when existing or planned forestry projects are repurposed to receive carbon funds. With regards to leakage, projects must demonstrate the carbon benefit in one area will not be released elsewhere. So if a forest is protected in one area, deforestation won't take place in a neighboring area for needed resources. And with regards to permanence, Projects must demonstrate carbon will be stored over the long term. The lack of permanence was clearly demonstrated in the case of Brazil, when the gains in forest protection in the Brazilian Amazon over the previous decade evaporated when President Bolsonaro came into office in 2019, and deforestation rates in the country increased significantly. These environmental integrity issues are often violated in the context of REDD+. Due to the mounting critiques of project-based REDD, including the high project costs and minimal co-benefits, unmet environmental integrity, and the evidence that the drivers were more systemic and couldn't be fully addressed on a project-by-project basis, jurisdictional or nested REDD+ emerged to address these concerns and limits of project-based REDD. Jurisdictional REDD refers to state programs that cover the entire legal territories of political entities such as countries, subnational states, and provinces. The idea is to nest policies and actions across scale to better ensure forest protection. While jurisdictional REDD is intended to provide multiple benefits and shift destructive policies and economies toward low-emission rural development, some scholars argue we might see some similar outcomes found in existing REDD projects, given they're their closest relative to the jurisdictional approach. There's concern that top-down policies might impact smallholders and fail to address commodity drivers of deforestation, given political economic priorities such as national income, employment needs, and debt repayments. And some empirical studies on jurisdictional REDD in places like Acre, Brazil, have shown that, like REDD projects, national and subnational jurisdictional approaches have fallen short in demonstrating equity and effectiveness in reducing forest carbon emissions. Nonetheless, jurisdictional approaches are increasingly positioned as a dominant and favored strategy to reduce forest carbon emissions in a post-Paris Agreement world, intended to support nationally determined contributions, or NDCs. NDCs are the voluntary targets country governments have set for national climate action. Strong safeguards are recommended to avoid against impacts of REDD. Also necessary is financing for forests commensurate to the scale of the problem. Funding for jurisdictional REDD is being provided in phases: REDD readiness, implementation, and results-based finance. So I want you to read this figure from right to left. In the first phase, REDD readiness provides governments at all levels with capacity building and prepares countries for funding based on results-based payments like carbon markets. Phase 2 is implementation. In this phase, funding supports countries in the implementation of national policies and climate change mitigation actions as outlined in their national REDD+ strategies. REDD 3 refers to results-based finance. This finance is associated with payments to governments according to measured reductions in carbon emissions from demonstrated activities. This finance can be provided through both compliance and voluntary carbon markets. There are various sources of finance for REDD+. They include multilateral finance, bilateral finance, and carbon markets. Multilateral finance includes funds managed by institutions such as the World Bank. These funds are approximately a third of internationally supported REDD activities. With regards to bilateral finance, countries fund forest activities and programs in the Global South. Norway is the largest contributor to bilateral finance for REDD+, followed by the UK, Germany, and the US. Carbon markets are a major source of REDD+ finance. The private sector in particular is playing an increasingly important role in the compliance and voluntary carbon market, investing in offsets, modifying supply chain practices, and tracking commodity production to curb deforestation. Total finance, including both market and non-market sources, for all recorded years through 2019 is approximately $7.2 billion. However, to date, climate finance has been insufficient and incommensurate to the scale of the crisis. If climate change mitigation in forests is to succeed, it will require significant funding. While the IPCC estimates that $1.6 trillion to $3.8 trillion is required annually to meet the Paris goal of keeping global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, climate finance remains low, including for forests. During the 2021 International Climate Meeting in Glasgow, COP26, $1.7 billion was committed to protect forests and support indigenous peoples and local communities who steward the land. While billions of dollars are being raised for forests, these amounts are insufficient in comparison to the trillions of dollars invested in forest risk commodities, such as beef, soy, palm oil, and timber, the gray finance that destroys and degrades forests. These commodities are major drivers of deforestation and are often incentivized by state subsidies. Also noteworthy are the subsidies spent on fossil fuels. In 2017, 2 years after the adoption of the Paris Agreement, according to a study by the International Monetary Fund, $5.2 trillion were spent on fossil fuel subsidies globally. In the context of urgent climate change and from an equity perspective, these funds currently supporting fossil fuels and forest destroying activities should be rechanneled to initiatives that protect and restore forests and other ecosystems that support climate, biodiversity, and local and indigenous communities. The carbon market is a major source of finance for forests through the sale of carbon offsets. A carbon offset is a reduction of carbon emissions or any other greenhouse gas measured in carbon dioxide equivalents. Offsets are generated from projects or programs that are intended to compensate for emissions made elsewhere. Because greenhouse gases mix in the atmosphere freely, the logic is that it doesn't matter where reductions take place. So say an entity sets a goal to be carbon neutral. It should make as many reductions on site as possible through renewable energy, energy efficiency, and sustainable land use activities. And for any additional reductions not possible or too expensive to make on site at the time, carbon offsets can be purchased from a variety of activities, including forest projects anywhere in the world. The buying and selling of carbon offsets takes place on compliance and voluntary carbon markets. Carbon forestry is considered a precursor of REDD+ projects. Carbon forestry refers to climate change mitigation in forests that includes afforestation, reforestation, and sustainable forest management. These projects often aim to provide co-benefits or additional social and ecological benefits beyond carbon. Payments for ecosystem services and carbon forestry activities have had tremendous influence on the design and implementation of REDD+, and some of the same challenges and pitfalls found in carbon forestry have also been found in REDD+. So I want to share a case study of a forestry-based carbon offset project that demonstrates more concretely some of the issues I've discussed. The case study is based on my own research in Chiapas, Mexico. The carbon forestry project began in the mid-1990s and offered an early model of a carbon offset. The goal of the project was to reduce carbon emissions and deliver local sustainable development benefits to communities, many of whom managed land in ejidos, a type of land tenure based on common property arrangements. The project drew the interest and participation of local and indigenous communities struggling with lower commodity prices for coffee in the highlands and corn in the tropical lowlands, given the challenging economic impacts of neoliberal agricultural policies on small producers. The carbon payments pegged to carbon market prices were extremely low, and therefore there was an emphasis on planting high-value timber species with the promise of future financial benefits from selling the timber as an incentive for participation. I had the honor to conduct this research in a Mayan community in the Lacandon rainforest, the largest tropical rainforest in North America. Corn played an important role to the lives and livelihoods of the community. Like many communities in the region, corn is produced in a system of shifting cultivation called the milpa, where corn is grown for a few years and then the land is left fallow for often long periods. The fallow is managed and planted with fruit and other trees with high use value to the community. Due to the low prices offered on the carbon market, most small farmer carbon producers planted high-value timber species, mostly in monoculture plantations, in the spaces previously dedicated to managed fallows between the planting of subsistence crops. In many cases, trees were attacked by a moth larva that stunted tree growth, reducing the value of the timber. Fire also destroyed planted trees. In 1998, fire destroyed large portions of the Lacandon jungle, exacerbated by deforestation in drier microclimates. This is an example of how the environmental integrity issue of permanence might be violated. Furthermore, smallholder carbon producers faced uncertain financial benefits from timber. This was the result of long growth cycles to harvest mahogany and tropical cedar. Also, timber harvesting for exchange on a market violated indigenous and common property forest governance that prohibited the cutting of trees for commercial uses. Community members were converting their subsistence agricultural plots in the fallow stage to timber production as part of the carbon forestry project. And when my team and I conducted a carbon analysis to understand the climate benefits of a carbon project compared to the fallow system, the results were surprising. We found that the indigenous managed fallows had the potential to store and sequester up to 3 times more carbon than the carbon project that displaced indigenous land use practices. This shows the importance of indigenous knowledge and governance for climate change mitigation. It also reveals fundamental contradictions of existing carbon markets. Therefore, climate justice approaches to tropical forests must include indigenous and local communities.